this? Yes, good. I'm sharing this and recording it. Yep, I wanted to make this available to the folks that participate in the project. We have over 330 Reynolds men that are participants in the project, and so the members are what makes the project great. And I want to be able to explain sort of why YDNA is useful for genealogy, and to share with people like what we've been doing that I think is beneficial. For folks that have been to either the 2019 or 2018 reunions, you've seen an older version of this presentation, but because so many of the participants in this session are new, and because I get a lot of similar questions related to these things, I thought it would be still useful to cover for this audience. And so a thread I'm going to try to use to talk about YDNA is this question of, okay, there are lots of Reynoldses. You know, you see 25 on your screen right now. So are we all related? Is it, if you could just research back further in time, you will come to the place where we're all from one village in wherever, and the first person was named Reynolds and everyone inherited the name after that. So that is the question that I'll try to set out to answer through this, and I will demonstrate how we know that we're right in the answer to this question. So I'll explain how we use YDNA to get an answer to this question, not just the general question of are we related, but to the specific question of are Charles and I related, or are Ned and I related? Do we share a direct line male ancestor to any of the other folks on this call? And I'll give an update on a few of our larger case studies. So, you know, some of our classic lines like the James of North Kingstown line and the John of Watertown line, there are sufficient descendants of those lines that we have a lot of tested men now and get some very interesting results. Again, trying to stay out, I intend to stay out of the technical stuff as much as possible, but if somebody has a question about anything, please feel free to ask it. I'd say if you really have a question, as I'm going through, feel free to shout it out during the middle. I might ask you to hold it to the end, or I might be able to answer it right on the spot. Yep. Okay, so this book has come up several times today during several different discussions. There's two books by a fellow named Stephen Tillman. He wrote two big, wait, you see it so you can see a picture of this. He wrote two very big, thick, very text-dense books on Reynolds genealogy that he published in the middle of the 20th century. These are two books that have genealogies of many of the same people, but he published a version in, I believe, in the 40s, and then a second version in the 1950s. Okay, so he published these books. These books essentially explain how many Reynoldses, particularly in the US South, but not just the South, all descend from this fellow named Christopher Reynolds. You know, it's the idea there was this immigrant that came in 1622. He was an indentured servant of the Edward Bennett's family, and he eventually went on to have his own land and have a big family, and the family spread and spread and spread. And all Reynoldses of the South descend from Christopher Reynolds. And so this big book all ties, you know, thousands of Reynoldses back to Christopher. Some other sources I don't remember if Tillman said this or what, but some other sources say, okay, well, there was Christopher, that Christopher had a brother named Robert that, you know, about the same time was in Boston. And they had another brother, John, who went to Watertown, and James, you know, all these brothers, you know, sort of came and spread out across the US, and they all have the same father. And so all of these lineages of Reynolds all sort of descend from the same grandfather. So this is, this concept really permeated old-fashioned genealogy. And you used to be able to submit your application, you know, your application to the Daughters of the American Revolution or the Sons of American Revolution and point to this book and say, I'm Tommy Reynolds, and Christopher Tillman said I connect to, you know, whoever it might be, a particular ancestor that was in the Revolutionary War. And Lineage Society said, oh, okay, well, it's in that book, must be true. And so genealogies that were based on these publications flourished. And you still see them because on Ancestry, lots of these Lineage Society applications are available that show lineages all going back to Christopher Reynolds. However, in 2020, or maybe even to scrutinizing researchers in 1970, the problem is there's no source information in these huge tomes. There's actually almost no source information. In fact, just about all of the source information, I don't know if you can see my mouse as I scroll it around the screen, but most of the source information is included in this single paragraph on the front of the whole book that says, you know, this information was collected from things like census reports and family Bibles and journals and people we talk to. Hold your hand up if you think that that meets our genealogical proof standard. Thumbs down. Good answer. Thumbs down. Does it mean it's all wrong? No. But it means we have no idea if it's right. And another issue is he published 2 of these books. They have different information in them. And the second version doesn't explain how the new conclusions were reached compared to the first version. So not just do we have one big book out there with questionable info, but there are actually 2 books out there with the same problems of provenance. Okay, so as many people have brought up here, how do we know if we can trust it? What should we do? So decades of, you know, RFA newsletters and publications and things any Reynolds researcher from the South has seen on Ancestry, pro and conflicting information. We have decades of newsletters where dedicated researchers have reanalyzed. They said, okay, here's what this is what Stephen Tillman says my lineage is. Here's what my research says this lineage is. And of course, all of this, these lineages are repeated, you know, thousands of times on Ancestry. Just raise your hand if you are from a Reynolds line from the South and you have been told you descend from Christopher Reynolds. Okay, right. Anyway, so, oh, the pictures weren't supposed to pop up yet, but okay, so what did other Reynolds researchers think? We talked about the newsletters. The results are mixed. Sort of the middle part of the 20th century, people were more deferential to Tillman's books. RFA annuals, the old ones also speculated on this idea that, yeah, all of these lines, if you could just get back a few more generations, you know, the John of Weymouth line, the John of Watertown line, if you could just get back a few more generations, you'd see how all these folks like connect in one family. And so it raises all these questions. R.J. Reynolds, this is him on the top, the tobacco king. You know, is he a cousin of mine? How does the aluminum foil fit in? Because any people have heard of Reynolds Wrap before they probably met a human Reynolds. Ryan Reynolds, is he my other cousin? Don't know. If we could only trace, you know, if there were only more court records that could take us back a little bit further, if the censuses had started in 1600 instead of 1790, we'd have this all nailed down, right? So no, what we need is a new type of evidence, you know, beyond wills and probate records, etc. So here comes DNA. And this is just real quick. There are really three types of DNA that genealogists use. And I'll cover those very quickly. Ross had explained a good portion of this before. First off, there's autosomal DNA, which covers all of your ancestors going back a few generations. You know, autosomal DNA is really good at identifying if someone is your sibling or your father or your first cousin or your second cousin. So it's great for identifying close-in relationships. Something called mitochondrial DNA would trace your maternal line, your mother's 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 line.
Just a little slow, please.
Okay. Yep, thank you. Traces your maternal line. So if you want to know if you have connections along a direct maternal line, you might test that type of DNA. Another type of DNA that males inherit come from their father, and it comes from their paternal grandfather and their grandfather's grandfather. You know, it is passed down. Daughters never inherit a Y chromosome from their father, ever, really. So a single chromosome that doesn't mix, is passed intact straight from father to son to father to son to father to son to father to son. And because it isn't mixed at each generation, it comes down intact. So one male that descends from a particular grandfather would share an almost identical Y chromosome with another male that comes down a different line from the same grandfather. So who can tell me what also comes down your in many cases, what also comes down your father's 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 line? I mean, besides YDNA, surnames. The last name Reynolds often, not always, but often comes from your father's 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 father, at least in English ethnic societies. Surnames have been passed down traditionally from fathers to sons, along with a Y chromosome. So this makes YDNA particularly useful for studying studying connections between people with the same surname. Any questions before I go on to the next sections?
When did surnames begin?
Excellent question. It depends. Something like between the year 1000, 1100 AD in the British Isles. Around that period, they started to take up, and they were pretty much widespread by something like 1400 AD, approximately. That's not exact, but in that they began to become inherited consistently during that period. Excellent question. We'll touch on a little more of that later.
It's probably also worth noting that they were only written down as of like the late 19th century, so that's where you get all these.
Yes, yes, good point, Nathan. So there are Reynolds. Yes, absolutely. So there is also variation within specific surnames because they were just oral for a long, long time.
Tommy, quick question on the YDNA.
Charles,
So,
go ahead.
if I was to understand you, so if one man 10 generations back had two sons, those two lines eventually will have the exact same YDNA?
So exact is the only question. Yes, they will have almost exactly the same YDNA. As in a rough test, a low resolution test would say yes, their YDNA is exactly the same. It would take a very high resolution test to say yes, they're very, 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 very close, but they have these specific small differences. All good questions. Keep asking them as we go along. So let's say you want to find out about your Reynolds YDNA. What can you do? Well, you join the Reynolds surname YDNA project, and we will advise you on a test to take. Depending on your circumstances and your goals, we might advise one type of test versus the other, including considerations for your budget and sort of which group of Reynoldses you think you might match. But Nancy and I, who are administrators of the surname project, would be able to give you advice on what type of test to take. Okay, so you decide you're going to take a test, and you take it. They mail you a swab kit. It's simple, painless. You mail in your little cheek swabs, and something like 8 weeks later, you get an email saying your results are available, and log into the website. You're really excited, and you get to the website and you see something that looks like this. You say, what do I do with that? I have no idea. So fortunately, there is a matching database that will take your results and compare them to other, if you give the database permission, and will compare your results to everyone else that is tested, both outside the Reynolds project and inside the Reynolds project. If you're both in the Reynolds project, you can see a little more information of each other's results, but it would also show you if you're a match to someone with a total different last name that you wouldn't have expected to match. It will give you that information. Okay, so your results come in, then project administrators like Nancy and I, we will take your results, see who you match. The Reynolds project has a huge list of 300 plus men. It shows their results in this way. And the administrators of the project would say, oh, okay, so these are privatized because that's important. So normally you'd see names here in this third column that's blurred out. But what we'd see is okay, John Doe Reynolds has tested, his results are in, and he matches. Look, there's this cluster. It's called, you see it's called family group 3. Look, John Doe Reynolds, his results are in. He basically matches these men in group 3. To Charles's question, does he have to be a perfect match? No. John Doe Reynolds does not have to be an absolute perfect match to be placed in this group, in this group 3. He will be a approximate match to the men in group 3. and he will not be a match at all to the men in group 7 down here. So that it will be immediately apparent who you do not match at all. So a useful outcome of a YDNA test is showing who you don't match. And for example, you might see, can you give me a thumbs up if you see my mouse moving around in the window? Okay, good, thank you. You might see there are several of these lines say that they connect to a particular James Reynolds of Rhode Island. Some don't go quite that far back, but a few of them are James, a few of them are younger lines. We happen to know that this group 3 is, I think I can say, certainly our James of North Kingstown group. So all the men in this group either descend from James or descend from a cousin line of James. So when you're placed in this group, it can be confirmation that you are either a descendant of or an approximate relation to one of these sort of well-documented lineages. Okay, it's helpful. At the top it says DNA testing is a team sport. Yeah, because if others didn't test, all you would have is results like this that are absolutely useless. But it's useful when you compare yourself to all the other Reynolds men that have taken tests. And so your grouping, so administrators will put you in a group, and your grouping is absolutely key. And so think back to the question at the very beginning of this, are all Reynoldses related? Well, here are these two groups. So within either of these two particular groups, the men placed here have a common ancestor, have a common direct line male ancestor within about the last 600 years. So in the surname era, they have a Reynolds named common ancestor. However, across different groups, they have common ancestors. These two groups have a common ancestor on their male line that is about 48,000 years back in time. So this is that in the surname era? Is that after people adopted surnames? No, not at all. This is way back in time. So we can say with absolute confidence that men in group 3 do not have a common Reynolds named ancestor with men in group 7. Absolute certainty. Across the project of 300-ish tested men, there are over 40 distinct family groups of Reynoldses. So all you're seeing here is 2. It's 2 of our large groups, but there are over 40 Reynolds groups of tested men that do not relate to each other. So they don't relate to each other along a direct male line. So question arises, why are there so many distinct Reynolds groups, both in the project and in the world, that are not yet tested? And the answer is the men that adopted the Reynolds surname during this Middle Ages period, the men that took on the surname Reynolds were already genetically diverse before when they took the surname Reynolds during that period. So it didn't happen in one village, in one place, and then they all spread out from there. That is basically impossible because not just, we have participants. So the groups I showed you are 48,000 years separated. there are groups that are even more divergent than the ones I just showed you. We have we have many very distinct Y chromosomes in the YDNA project. And I'll stop for questions in just a minute. Let me get through a couple more things. So really, Reynolds is generally considered a British, an English, sometimes an Irish surname. It is expected that that is where the surname was first used, and then descendants from those folks, passed on the Reynolds surname. And so what we can see is that we see patterns, that there's clearly, how does genetic diversity work within English surnames? So we can categorize English surnames into, let's just say, 3 levels. This is kind of arbitrary, but I think you'll get the point. So there are some extremely rare surnames. There's a genealogist named Oh, I see. Someone's drawing on my slide deck. That's fine. So we see that so there's a genealogist named Jim Austin. He publishes a great blog about genetic genealogy. He has tested not every Austin he's met, but every Austin that's of a different line that he could find. He has YDNA tested, and he's found that essentially they all relate. In the image I just showed you, they would all be in one group. So these surnames are said to have single origins, as in there was a man in some village somewhere, and this researcher knows that place, that took the name Austin and passed it on to his descendants. And the only other Austins are genetically are folks that were adopted in or that were adopted out of the family that have Austin YDNA. There are other rare surnames that tend to be single origin because they reflect essentially no genetic diversity, because the people that took that name originally and then passed it to their descendants weren't genetically diverse because it was one family, usually. Then there are, what they call multi-origin surnames. These are extremely common surnames, and these, as you'd expect, have they have a lot of genetic diversity. Every village in medieval England had a smith or 10 smiths, and had a baker, and there was an old one, and someone with browner skin. There were tailors, there were carpenters. So these surnames that are extremely common, their projects, instead of having 40 groups like Reynolds's, they might have 100 or 200 distinct groups. And then there's, other categories of surnames that are somewhere in the middle, meaning that they weren't taken up extremely broadly, like by multiple families in every village, and they aren't single origin, as in it wasn't just one family that took on this surname and passed it on from there. So, who wants to answer the question? Are all Reynoldses related? I see heads shaking, and that would be the right answer. All Reynoldses are not related, at least not in the surname timeframe, not since the year 1100 or 1200 or 1400. Yeah, if you go back far enough in time, yes, you could say we're all related, but not on the scale that genealogists are interested in usually. Okay, I'll stop there to answer questions up to this point about things I just covered.
Where would we see that if you've taken that YDNA test? Where would I go and look at it? I know that Philip took it, and
Yes.
I don't know where I would see it.
Yes.
On the Reynolds site, on the Reynolds.
Yes, so it would be on the Family Tree DNA web page. You could just Google that. And because I remember helping Phil with the test.
Yeah.
If you can't find his login info, please be in touch with me. I can put you in touch with someone at Family Tree DNA that can make sure you can get in and see all of Phil's.
No, I have the information. I just don't know where to find it. I thought it was on the RFA website for our line or something.
Yes, I understand your question, but the technical results exist all in the Family Tree DNA webpage.
Okay.
Yeah, just,
Thank you.
When you hit that, it takes 21 seconds for it to change on
oh,
the screen.
interesting.
So you
okay.
want to tell the people there that, oh,
Got it. My dad just explained to me that after I advance the slide on my computer, it takes something like 20 seconds for the slide to advance on your screens. So, okay, I'll try to advance quickly and talk slowly. Yeah. More questions at this point? Okay. Now I'll try to show you some more specific applications of, first on a conceptual level of how we actually use this. And then I'll get into at least one sort of very specific example, like an applied group in our project to talk about how we use this. Okay, so this is the conceptual model here. So, in the project, this is right now in time. The bottom row is going to be, there are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, there's several men. Most of them are Reynoldses. Not all of them are Reynoldses, but there's a bunch of men that take YDNA tests. These Reynoldses have traditional genealogy. They're members of Ancestry or whatever, and they've done old-fashioned research, and they trace their male lines back in time. This Reynolds goes back. He knows he descends from William, who lived, about 1750 AD. These Reynoldses, they are, what would that be? They would be second cousins. They descend from a Nathaniel that was, lived about the same period. This guy traces back to Richard, but, and these men, they're thrown in there for examples because this does really happen. But everyone gets to a point where in their traditional genealogy, they get back and they hit a brick wall. Right? You just end somewhere. The paper trail ends. So, yeah, thank you for doing that. So it looks like there is indeed a real lag here. Okay. So at some point you hit a brick wall. I'm waiting for the brick wall to show up on your screens.
I
I'm
have it
seeing
on
it.
mine.
I have brick walls.
I have brick walls.
Yep, all good here.
And now you see these brick walls. Yes, you understand. Everyone understands. Okay, thank you. Great idea. Okay, you get to a brick wall. What do? Well, maybe Reynolds number 1 over here sees Reynolds number 2 and number 3 posting on the Roots Web, message board talking about Nathaniel, who was in Albemarle County, Virginia. Well, he knows William was in Albemarle County, Virginia. They're trying to figure out how they're connected. Don't know. Are they related? Don't know. Who knows? But they're in the same geographic area. Okay, so this is where YDNA can help. And I have to wait 30 seconds till you get to see what happens next.
It's showing, Tommy.
Showing up.
It is showing. Okay, yep, good. So what you can get with YDNA is you may or may not be able to find names of men that connect upstream of these most distant ancestors. But what you'd find is that some of these markers, you know, the markers that we showed you on a slide earlier, they may have these markers in common. And without getting technical into what a marker actually is, let's just say it's something that makes the chromosome distinct. So, okay, these lines, they share these two markers. You know, this Y, so Reynolds 1, sorry, that's a bad example. Reynolds 2 and Reynolds 3 and Reynolds 4 share this blue marker Y288. They have this marker that Reynolds 1 does not have, but they share it between Reynolds 2, Reynolds 3, Reynolds 4. They know that they have in common DF29, FGC 21981. Never mind what the numbers mean. It doesn't matter for this purpose. But what they know, you know, Reynolds 1, Reynolds 2, Reynolds 3, and Reynolds 4, they all have some of these markers in common. Though you can see those markers as a grandfather. We don't know DF29's name, but it is a marker that first occurred in some male son when he was born. His father didn't have it, but it's like a Xerox machine. You know, so the Y chromosome has, I forget how many, 29 million base pairs. When if you were to make 29 million copies in a Xerox machine, there would be at least one miscopy. Somewhere in there, something's going to go wrong. So that's what happens with YDNA. It's not an exact replication from father to son, but it's pretty close. And so what these markers are is it's a miscopy that happens at one point in time. But then every time the Y chromosome is passed down, the same miscopy is passed down to every generation. I don't know if I explained that well. Are there questions on that concept before I go further?
I understand the concept, but I have one question.
Go
So
ahead.
if
Go ahead.
those lines are all DF29 related,
Yes.
does that mean if Reynolds line 4 shows a Richard, that Reynolds line 3 and Reynolds line 2 also include Richard?
Good question. It would, no, not necessarily, because DF29 is so far up the tree. This one is so far back in time that it doesn't necessarily mean that that Reynolds 2 and Reynolds 3 also descend from Richard. Not necessarily.
Okay, thank you.
This is where it helps to have more and more people tested, so you can have higher resolution visibility into where the branches split off.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Excellent question. More questions about this concept. Really, these markers, they occur in one generation. They occur one time, and they are passed down to every direct male descendant of the person in which the mutation occurs. Okay, so these markers can be seen as common grandfathers. So anyone that descends from Y590 or anyone that has marker Y590 has the same grandfather at that point in time. Okay, so that's the concept. And now we'll talk about some applications that we have as Reynoldses. So can you, okay, it looks like you now see a screen that says in the past year. So good. In the past year, we've been adding, so just the base of it is, look, here is the RFA ancestors list. You know, this is the list that has existed for decades, and we've been adding to it recently you know, the list is getting longer as more people identify their most distant known ancestor. We add it to the list. We are also adding, as they become tested, we're adding the haplogroups. These are the YDNA signatures, or the fingerprints of each of these lineages. So what we have in the case of, you know, the John and Ann Holbrook line, we have a couple men that descend from this line that have had high resolution YDNA tests. And based on their compared results, we know that they share this. You can see any row as a fingerprint. There are the ancient mutations that are thousands of years old, but then there are also the newer mutations that really define these lines quite specifically. So you don't need to know, for the purposes of this discussion, it's not important exactly what these markers are, but we can see that, you know, Robert of Boston and John of Weymouth, they're both connected to this ancient family. So way back in time, they do share a father line, but we know from scientific studies that this U106 marker predates the surname era. So that marker, their shared ancestor, was thousands of years ago, something like 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, rather than after the Middle Ages, when their common ancestor would have the Reynolds surname. And so these ancient haplogroups, like, these are so well tested and so well researched across thousands of scientific studies and tested living men. You know, when they dig up some Vikings in the North Sea and examine their haplogroups, they would often find, you know, these ancient haplogroups. But what they wouldn't find in those, you know, ancient DNA sites are these more contemporary haplogroups, because these mutations simply hadn't happened yet, you know, back thousands of years ago. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to develop this list as much as possible. So we have as many ancestors listed, and we're trying to identify the haplogroups. Sorry, haplogroups should be understood as just YDNA signatures or fingerprints. And we're trying to develop this with as high a resolution as possible. Because the result is, let's say someone thinks that they may descend from the, you know, James of North Kingstown line. They, you know, their paper genealogy just points them in that direction. So now they could do several things. They could get a high resolution test, and that would either put them in the James bucket, or maybe one of the other buckets if their paper genealogy you know, was off. Or with very specific guidance, they could test very specific markers. It is technically possible for a person to swab their cheek and be tested in a lab for only one marker. So if it was someone of the James line, we'd recommend that they test for marker BY61723. And that test costs about $20 plus shipping. And it's only looking at literally one base pair on your entire Y chromosome. So it's pretty amazing that we are to the point where in an entire chromosome, we can test for one particular marker and have pretty good confidence that the person is at least in the family of James of Kingstown. And that applies for all these other groups that we have high resolution haplogroups for. I can say that also this isn't perfect. There's a lot of nuance to any of these scenarios, but that's why, Nancy and I as administrators, that's why we help the project participants with their results and understand what it means, what the results mean, what the results don't mean, etc. I should say that even if you take a high resolution test, that's the more expensive test, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to get this sort of great, precise answer for your ancestor. Because if you are of a lineage that is under tested, as in other Reynoldses haven't tested, or not just other Reynoldses, in some cases, like no men, like even closely related to you at all, even thousands of years ago, have tested yet. And that's the case sometimes, in which case you're still left with these sort of raw results that don't have any sort of useful resolution or definition to them.
Tommy, is that the explanation for why some of the ancient haplogroups or contemporary haplogroups are blank? Because nobody in those groups has tested?
Yes, exactly. And there are a lot more lines that have not tested than you see in this diagram. I sort of edited this diagram to demonstrate this. But yes, so for example, this line 13, which is William and Alice Kitson. So either to my knowledge or based on any information provided by any participants in the project, none of them descend or could demonstrate that they descend from this William. So yes, there are lots of blank lines, usually because that line hasn't been tested.
What does it mean when there are many contemporary haplogroups listed, markers listed, like line 15, you see a whole bunch of them?
Yep.
But line 12, there's only 3.
Yeah, good question. I would say my immediate response is that in line 3, so I would say it could be that just as many of these results, so this is abridged. First off, this is really abridged. What you would do is you would take what it says here and look into a much more detailed list that administrators know where to find that. But this is a sort of shorthand that's good enough for this web page, because anybody that would use this information would often be in touch with the administrators. So it could be that line 12 actually has as many steps as line 15 in this contemporary group. It's just that for one reason or another, we didn't identify all of them. These haplogroups come as a cascade. They're a series of steps. And if we were to list all of them for everyone, this page would, this web page would go on and would not be meaningful. So we've sort of abridged it so it fits into a viewable display.
Thank you.
All good questions, and keep them coming. Okay, so before I turn to one or two of the actual specific detailed projects, just a couple things about where we want to go with this. First off, we want to list all most distant Reynolds ancestors. We want to test their descendants so we can identify their YDNA signature. We have started to cultivate a lookup list, and the idea is here that, okay, I'm a Reynolds. I know my contemporary haplogroup. Let's say I'm digging through the census records for Joe mentioned earlier, Greene County, Tennessee, and I find some William Reynoldses listed in Greene County, Tennessee. I want to know, might I descend from one of those William Reynoldses? what we've started to compile on the web page that's here is the lineages, the self-reported lineages of people in the project that wanted that information published here. We list, you know, with their anonymized kit number, their self-reported genealogy. So if I think, oh, maybe I'm related to this William Reynolds, I could go to this page, look up, see if anyone else that is tested claims to have been descended from that William. And if I see, oh, well, Nathan Reynolds has already claimed that William Reynolds and I don't match Nathan Reynolds, then I can discard this census record for William Reynolds as a possible ancestral match. I don't know if that made any sense, but we're working with members and using their self-reported genealogies to create something that could be a lookup list. Another area that I think will be very important and is very interesting is, you know, we have a scholarship fund financed by the Reynolds Family Association. You know, we request and occasionally the board approves contributions to a scholarship fund. We could use, with the board's approval, funds from this scholarship fund to incentivize Reynolds named men in Great Britain to do YDNA testing. There are some interesting matches already. The descendants of the Robert of Boston line have an interesting connection. It's deeper than the surname period, but it's an interesting connection nonetheless. We just found out this past week that a tested descendant of the John and Sarah Backus line got a Reynolds named match in England. If they match his YDNA, it is not a coincidence that they're both named Reynolds. Not a coincidence. So they have a common ancestor that predates John and Sarah Backus. This is great sort of information for genealogy. So it would be a process of identifying where their connection might be. Okay, I guess before turning to specifics, I wrote up, this is a year and a half or so old now, but I wrote up a resource that has a lot more info on using YDNA. I have that, it's available. All I'd have to do, if you're interested in it, shoot me an email. I can send it to you very easily and quickly. And I don't know, it's 10 pages or so explaining a lot about how YDNA works, in particular for Reynolds research. And it links to a lot of resources where you can learn more from people that speak about this in much better ways than I can. So if you're interested in that, just shoot me an email and you'll get a copy. Okay, before I open up for more general questions, I want to hit on at least one sort of more specific case study. Okay, it's going to be the James of North Kingstown group, because that is our most extensively tested group. My hypothesis is it is the most extensively tested because it is the largest. Don't know that that's true, but my hypothesis would be that this group has the most living descendants. Okay, we took a survey. Some of you all may have responded in March 2018, and more folks reported descending from this line than any of the other lines. There's also lots of good resources available, going way back to James. For example, Stephen Roth wrote a book in the early 1990s with lots of info. Also, Don, who was on the call, I understand, has written a book. I believe Don told me that. And Randy has made great speeches. For those at the last RFA reunion, Randy gave a great speech on his ancestry in the James line. So there are great resources available. The Reynoldses in the James group are in group 3. RFA provided some seed money to demonstrate how this concept works. That was a couple of years ago, and we're now in the point where it has clearly worked. So we've identified a terminal haplogroup for Reynolds. It is approximately this marker. We've also, since then, with more and more people testing, we have identified downstream markers. Let's see, between James's grandson, Francis Jr., and John. I have a diagram that'll make this a little more clear. Anyway, we're getting high resolution generational results coming through. We've confirmed that one of the old RFA lines is indeed descendant from James of North Kingstown, based on the results that'll be on your screen shortly. We've seen that there are some men named Eldred and Eldridge that have this Y chromosome signature. And if I recall, there are some men in this general group that have the Reynolds surname that actually have Gardner and or Eldridge YDNA. So there were some adoptions that happened at some point in the past. Okay, so let me turn for a second and I'll show you what can be constructed with this type of testing. Let me figure out how to pull this up. Okay. So here, don't worry, this is anonymized, so there isn't revealing information here that needs to be kept private. In the YDNA project, we have to sign agreements as administrators that we will not disclose people's private information. So there are clear guidelines on what can be included in demonstrations like this. So here's, I think, how this diagram should be seen. All of these colored bubbles here at the bottom are YDNA tested living Reynolds men. So these are men that have been tested. There are no names here of living people. They're all given code names. Those men have traditional genealogies. Let's just take a group over here. So, okay, here are 4 men, starting with this 21 something number and ending with this 857 number. This is 4 men that have taken tests. The yellow ones have taken medium resolution tests. The green ones have taken high resolution tests. Their traditional genealogies have shown all of these white boxes. So for privacy reasons, we don't identify anybody themselves or their father or their grandfather, but their great-grandfather. Going back, their research has shown that they go back to a certain point. The research of these 4 men showed that they descended from a pioneer, as he's called Pioneer John Reynolds in a bunch of old RFA recollections. He lived in Rowan and Wilkes County, North Carolina, and he had known descendants, lots of known descendants, but nobody until a year ago could confirm exactly where John had come from. But with the YDNA tests of these men, it became clear, because they had these markers in these blue boxes, it became clear that they, in fact, descend from James's grandson, Francis, well, his son Francis Sr., then his grandson Francis Jr., And there was only one document that suggested that pioneer John Reynolds in North Carolina came from Connecticut. I think it was Connecticut. But that wasn't enough to convince these people that yes, they indeed belong to this family. But YDNA evidence proved that these two men share pioneer John as an ancestor with these men, and that these four share this connection back to James. And you can see the same thing if you look down several of these other branches. And you know what we would do now, if someone came to the project, they could go one of two ways. They could take a high resolution test. You know, if they thought they belonged to this group, they could take a high resolution test, and if they belong to this group, we'd get even higher resolution results, sort of maybe downstream of one of these branches. Or if they were short on budget, we could test them for very specific markers. Let's say if they thought they descended from Pioneer John, we could test them for, you know, this specific marker for about $20 plus postage. And, you know, they'd have a rough estimate that yes, they indeed descend from this line. So this is not at all to say, this is our largest, most extensively tested group with the highest sort of resolution of branching. Most of the other 300 men in the project don't fit into such a nice descending group, but I wanted to use this because I think it's an example of what can be done with clusters of men that test, and how we can use their paper trail genealogies to combine that with YDNA testing to validate how folks connect. So now that I've walked through a specific example, I'd like to answer questions you all have, but I recognize maybe you all have somewhere to go and not everybody wants to stay for more questions. So that is really the end of my planned presentation. Anyone that wants to go, feel free. I'm not gonna keep you or make you feel bad about leaving. Please feel free to depart anytime. Anyone that has questions, I'm more than happy to stay and try to answer your questions.
Question?
Yes, go ahead. I don't know who was asking.
It's Leslie. My camera's not working on my little laptop. Anyway, my brother Mark tested the big Y about a year ago.
Yes.
And you thought you had someone else in his group that also tested big Y. Were there any results with that?
Yes, good question. Let me think. Their big Y results are not yet complete. So big Y is the high resolution test. The results come in two phases. And the first phase of that person's results are available. And they are certainly a match to your brother. But the high resolution portion of their results are not yet available. I would guesstimate that they'll be done in January, but it can be unpredictable. Sometimes the testing company has to rerun samples multiple times. But the answer is we don't have the results yet.
Okay, thanks.
Of course. Let me try to go back to, well, I'll keep it in sharing mode. Yeah, so other folks have questions. I'm pretty sure that if any one of you has a question, probably others in the group have the same question. So
if I understand it, because you said there's an excess of 40 Reynolds lines, but if for instance I'm able to go back another 3 generations because of something I find, is it anticipated that the number of lines will shrink as we do crossover a little bit on some family lines?
Yep. So good great question. I should try to clarify that I probably speak about lines in two different ways. There is the classic RFA list of lines that is now, oh, I think we're at line 71, and it's going to grow. But over time, some of those will be consolidated. For example, your line, I forget which number it is, but your line and Wayne's line. When we get to the point where we know who your ancestor is with Wayne, both of your lines will go away, and a new line that identifies your common ancestor will be added. If
All right, that makes sense. Thanks.
So the Reynolds list has more than 40 lines, but the YDNA project has those groups or those clusters of men that can be considered families of Reynoldses. There are about 40 different Reynolds families. And that was when I was talking about 40. Yeah, thanks. Good question. Other questions, and they can be about something I covered in the presentation, or even if you have specific questions about your results that you're fine discussing here in the group, please fire away.
Well, I didn't want to dominate, so I hated to keep asking questions, but
Darla, no problem. Go ahead.
If I think I know the answer to this, but hey, I thought I'd ask. Okay, you already know that basically I have no one else really that matches too closely with me. And of course, my brother's the one that did the YDNA, and it's obviously not a high, it's a medium resolution. But if his son, even if I had his son test, it wouldn't tell me anything else. Is that correct?
That's correct. So testing very closely related people in YDNA doesn't give you additional useful information.
I suspected that.
Yep, that's right.
Thank you.
And that's different than the autosomal DNA. In many cases, it's useful to test, an aunt and the aunt's brother, and an uncle. That would be useful, but autosomal DNA is a completely different discussion.
And I have also got autosomal tests, and I've also got an mtDNA test. But with the mtDNA, even though it goes back on female side, that wouldn't really ever help me identify a male on my side. Is that correct?
That is correct. That would not be applicable for Reynolds.
I was afraid of that. I kept thinking, well, maybe I could find a husband to a wife.
It could be useful, but it has its own set. Mitochondrial DNA has its own set of sort of complexities that I find don't typically help genealogy very much, but other people have had different experience with it.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
I really appreciate all your analysis on the DNA, because I don't care how much I read on it, I can't analyze it. So, thank you very much.
I understand. You're most welcome.
Do we have a way of identifying, let's say, in a line of who has taken the tests and how we relate? Let's say if you took the test and James Reynolds and Philip took it, would it be said that those males in that line have been tested, and if you want to find out how and they relate, they have been proven to be related? Is there a way of doing that?
Yes. So let me see if I understand what you're saying. So let's say, okay, your husband, Phil Reynolds, has taken a test, and you're saying if you want to know if another person that has not been tested before belongs in his close subfamily under James, would it be possible to test to confirm that? Is that your question?
No, I'm saying if I wanted to see who else in our association has been tested, so I know that, oh, there's Phil Reynolds in line 14, and there is Johnny and Don and Tommy.
Yep.
We already have been tested, and we know we're all related.
Yes.
That's what sort of would be nice to know.
Yes. We can. We if we don't know that just in our heads, we can answer that question for you.
See who has done it so far, and you know, if I meet somebody from outside, say, please do it. And, you know, just.
You have to ask their permission.
Yeah, right. So I mean, what we would do, well, first off, once you get DNA access to the site where Phil's results are, he can just log in and he can see who he matches.
Okay.
He will see the list of names. Some of those have been on this call today. He will see their names and it has their email addresses. If they've chosen to make that available to their matches like Phil, he would be able to get that directly also. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you again for explaining it so clearly. I have learned a lot and understood a lot this time.
Ah, good. I try. I don't think
No, very well done. Thank you.
Tommy, got a bit of a crowd outside of my window, so I won't speak long, but I will put another shout out that I would love to work with you on maybe kind of a landing page that we can refer testing candidates to that says why it would be so important and helpful to interest people and recruit people. You know, because a lot of the Reynolds candidates that I see, they look like they would be a good candidate, but maybe they don't have a strong genealogical tree, or you see they haven't logged in a long time. And I think it's an important part of it in our outreach is to look official and, you know, also, you know, put it in context. I think it would help us find more testers too. So glad to work with you on that.
Yeah, good point. Just to make sure I understand. Okay, so if there were a page added to our website that says, okay, look, here's how YDNA testing works, and here's what it can do for you, for example, that could be something we could just send a link to people. Yeah, understood.
Yeah, and I think, you know, a little pitch to it. You could belong to this notable Reynolds or that notable Reynolds. I think we all know that there's also a lot of interesting Reynolds that are not notable, but you know, just to bring more people into the fold and get them engaged, I think would be great.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah,
great.
I did have a question on the American progenitors list you have there. What's the process for submitting something for that? It's just like, here's the test, here's the research.
Good question. So we have been building that out without us validating the self-reported research. If there is something that stands out as like, I don't know, you tell me you descend from Genghis Khan and you want Genghis Khan listed. Like, well, I'd certainly read it with interest, but we wouldn't necessarily post it. But other than that, there aren't criteria. It's not like a lineage society in that way that you have to prove something. But yeah, so if you want the link, you could email me, I'll send you the link, or you can look in the most recent newsletter for the link to a simple form that'll just ask you to report it. What I emphasize is that report your confirmed ancestor rather than your speculative ancestor.
Sure.
And we will list them straight away. And yep.
I actually have a pretty well confirmed ancestor. Well, it's actually not my ancestor. It's a different Arkansas line that I was researching.
Yeah.
That I believe that I have a DNA test for, and I believe is listed. Yeah, it is listed in that line. So at least from a high level, there should be an ancient haplogroup, entry there. I got speculative as to my ancestry, because again, there's a significant gap for mine. But one of the things I had planned to do over the next week is to, I've got some holiday time. I'm going to actually dig into some of those, documented pathways and matches that I've made, and say, hey, I've got 2 different lineages that go back to these people, and I've got a DNA test to them, and they're all already listed on the DNA project. So this should equal this.
Great. So without revealing any private information, I think I can say a thing or two about your cluster. You are in a particular cluster in the project that there are a good number of matching matching Reynolds men. You know, there are some men in groups with 2 people or with no matches whatsoever. But you have a healthy group of good matches that probably, I would hypothesize, descend from a colonial era ancestor. And rather than, you know, several immigrants having multiple different families, yours looks like it's the colonial era. And there were some good researchers that have now passed on that had good lineage information, not necessarily that ties together, but all sort of independent lineages back into Virginia.
Yeah, and that's what I'm going to work to at least navigate. I don't, especially for my ancestors, that, you know, being in Louisiana, you know, Mississippi, sort of that area in the early 1800s and before, I'm not going to find any sort of documented evidence there. But the folks further up north and that maybe stayed around New England that I do match with, I can probably, I plan to take the angle of doing more research there.
Yeah, great. Reach out as you have questions as you're exploring that.
Sure. Thanks.
Of course. Okay.
I have one more question, then I promise I'll
Go for it. You don't have to promise.
I know that on some of the other websites that I'm on, that there is a descendant of one of my great-grandfather's brothers.
Mm-hmm.
If I talked to him and tried to convince him to do DNA, what is the least amount of a DNA test that he could do that might help?
Yep, understood. So this is your Reynolds line. Is that correct?
Yes. My David Crockett's brother he's descended from his brother.
Yep. That sounds like that would be a very good person to test. What I often recommend is a 37 marker test, which is about $100 when it's on sale. And now in the holiday season, it's on sale. It will probably be on sale for about $100 probably through New Year's. What that would give you is that would give you enough information to validate that, yes, this person also connects to your David Crockett Reynolds.
Okay, great. I don't know that he would do it. He kind of lives under the grid, and I don't know that he would do it, but I thought I might try to convince him.
Yeah, I understand.
Thank you. That's all. I appreciate you.
Of course.
Go ahead.
Hey, I have a question, Tommy.
Yes. Hi, Tammy.
Hi. So we're line 57, and the contemporary hagiogroups on the Reynolds family page gives us 7 markers, and then line 20, there's 1 additional marker. They're all the same except for that last one. We don't necessarily know where that one comes into play. That's the most recent one for them. Is that what you were kind of talking about earlier with the additional test?
Yeah, let me I'm so visual. Let me get to the right place so I can see what you're explaining as you explain it. You're what, 50, what did you say? Yep, 57. Yep. Right. Okay. Can you now tell me your question?
So we have 7 hagiogroups listed. And the one that we are trying to tie into line 20. 57. No, I know. Yep, okay. The line that we're trying to tie into has 1 additional, which is the most recent, I'm guessing. Is that correct?
Okay. So, yeah, good question. You're looking into these. You're trying to understand them. All good. What I can say is that these can even update, not change. So what's written here should never change, but they could develop, as in become more specific over time, if that makes sense. So what's written here should never be wrong. It's just, it may be more specific 2 months or 6 months from now or 2 years from now. So I'll start with that. And then are you saying, so the connection between
Line 57 and line 20.
20, yes. Okay. So I'm gonna show you something. I've also actually, yeah, I can't pull that on the screen now, but essentially okay, what this means, good question. She's saying, okay, their line, which is, you know, here, ransom, most distant ancestor, this goes through a series of markers and ends at Y15104. Okay. However, we know that ransom and these markers fit under the umbrella group of, you know, John and Sarah of Watertown. But this group, this cluster, has a more specific marker also. And I would say it's because two more closely related descendants under John and Sarah have both tested positive for this marker. I would say watch your line, John and Sarah, as well as Ransom's line, over the next couple months, because we have a result that is being processed now that might give us better visibility into exactly how these relate to each other.
Okay. So having that additional marker on them doesn't mean it goes all the way back to John and Sarah for that. Is that, I'm not even sure if I'm understanding. Like,
yeah, I understand your question. And what I can say is, based on the information we have right now, we don't know. We don't know if ransom is under John and Sarah or just very closely in parallel to John and Sarah. The result we're waiting on now might answer that question. We hope will answer that question, because Vincent is also in the same category, in that you're sort of very close, and these additional results might tell us whether your Reynoldses, Tammy, and Vincent's are under John and Sarah or in an immediately parallel line. Okay. I hope I explained that in a understandable way.
it's good news. It's good.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Other questions? Okay. So with that, I'll let you all go. Like I said, I'd like to organize something, maybe shorter next time, but another time to get together, because, you know, it's pretty easy to join these things virtually. All right, so I want to wish everyone happy holidays. Be well, stay safe, stay healthy, and I look forward to being in touch sometime soon.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Tommy.
Great
Okay.
job.
Thank you all.
Good work putting those together.
All right.
Thank you,
Take
Tom.
care.
Excellent
Thank you, Tommy.
job.
Great work, Tommy.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Take care.